Okay, hello everyone. For those who participated in our first two sessions, welcome back. For those who missed either session, we're glad you're here today, and please contact me if you didn't receive the recordings for either session. For all of you, thank you so much for joining us for the last of our three-part lecture series on the history of the Israeli economy. My name is Amy Kaufman, Associate Director of Business Development at Israel Investment Advisors. And I am joined today by Brian Friedman, President, Co-founder, Principal, and Portfolio Manager at Israel Investment Advisors, and Daniel Master, Professor of Archaeology at Wheaton College and Director of the Levy Expedition to Ashkelon and Shimron Excavations. We are speaking to you from our respective homes, Daniel in Wheaton, Illinois, and Brian and I in Denver, Colorado. We know these are challenging times for many, and we wish you and your families our most sincere blessings for health and financial stability in these difficult times. As we begin our last week, we are excited to welcome Daniel to our webinar. With his expertise, he will take us on a trip back in time as he and Brian help us wrap up this series. Please feel free to send us questions through the Q&A functionality in Zoom or comments through the chat option. Brian's extensive experience and passion for Israel, and in particular for the Israeli economy, goes back decades. And through our collaboration with the Friends of the Israel Antiquities Authority and Daniel, you will be able to understand how these ancient pieces fit in helping explain how Israel became the amazing modern country it is today. A country over 3,000 years old and at the same time 72 years young. Today, Daniel builds on this topic by taking us back in time to deepen our understanding of ancient Israel's economic practices and the long-lasting impact those practices had on the future of the Jewish people and their quest for statehood. Our audience today is made up of a mixed group of individuals, some of whom are very familiar with Israel Investment Advisors and some who are not. Allow me to take a brief moment to describe who we are and what we do. Israel Investment Advisors is a Denver, Colorado-based subsidiary of GHP Investment Advisors, one of Colorado's largest wealth managers. Since its inception in 2010, IIA has been the premier vehicle for US accredited individual investors, foundations, and endowments to invest in the Israeli stock market. We provide a vehicle for those individuals and organizations with pro-Israel values to align their investments with Israel and participate in the long-term growth of the Israeli economy. Before I hand it over to Daniel, I want to especially thank our partners in this endeavor, the Friends of the Israel Antiquities Authority, and of course, Daniel, for working with us on making this lecture series happen. Daniel, will you tell us a little bit more about you, your work, and the Friends of the IIA, please?
Thank you, Amy, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. And Amy was right, we're going to sort of take a long trip back, a distance. So you've been, these last sessions, you've been dealing with sort of the modern world, and we're going to move to the ancient world. And so right away, I'm sharing my screen with you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and so on my screen, what I think you can see, if I'm correct, is a picture of ancient Israel, right? It's a picture of two houses that are set in the middle of a courtyard, and you can see people doing all kinds of things in this particular setting. This is an illustration that was put together by two of my mentors, Lawrence Steger and Philip King. And Professor Steger and Professor King researched the world of ancient Israel to great extent, and they commissioned an artist here to try to capture as many different activities that would go on in a typical Israelite household as they could in one picture, sort of an iconic image in the things that they were working on. And so I really like to use it because if you look at this image closely, you can see all kinds of economic activities that are going on here, particularly as it relates to production and consumption, as we try to understand ancient Israel's economy. And of course, as we look at this image, it looks very different than Israel today or our world today in many ways. And it looks so different, and indeed the ancient world looks so different, that for much of the 20th century in economic anthropology, as people studied these past societies, they often described them as primitive economies. The idea was that these economies were missing certain concepts that we have, commercial concepts that we have that sort of characterize the modern world, certainly the modern capitalist world. And so the idea was that these were small, insular settlements with really no idea of the profit motive or some of those kinds of things that we take for granted. So I want to first dispel that notion and take sort of a 30,000-foot view about what we now think about ancient economy, or at least what I think about ancient economy, and get us started. And then we're going to zoom in on the kingdoms of Israel and Judah slowly, and try to understand what made them tick from the standpoint of economics. So that's our goal. That's where we're headed. And so we start with this particular image, and we're going to jump to, I'll show you 4 different data sets that I think shape our understanding of the ancient world, the big picture, just a little bit differently. And so follow me through those 4, and then we'll take a moment and I'll hear some of your questions. But I'm going to start with this image here. Just a second. Let me see if I can get this working. Now you see this map of ancient Anatolia. Yes? Just making sure my technology is working. Good. So you see this map of ancient Anatolia, and this is a map which describes trade, which has been understood in the last half of the 20th century because of excavations at a site named Kanesh. And you'll see I'm going to point out Kanesh with my pointer here, right in the middle of Anatolia. And at this site, archaeologists found a merchant district, a district where all the foreign merchants lived, and they recovered more than 20,000 texts that describe the economic acts of these groups of people. Now you can see this is very long ago. This is the 19th century BC, so more or less before the biblical period, before the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But what they discovered when they looked at these texts was that merchants were coming from Ashur all the way over here, and they were bringing tin and textiles over here, and they were returning with silver and gold. And as they read the records that these people had left behind, because they wrote on cuneiform tablets, they found price changes, they found risk-taking, they found letters of credit, they found all kinds of instruments that we often think of as very modern that were part of the economy of that time. And so right away, we start to get a sense for a lot of those things that often are thought of as modern in terms of risk-taking, buy low, sell high, the commercial economy, all of those kinds of things, even private trade. All those things are present in the Near East from a very early moment. And so that's one of the data sets that I think in the last 50 years has really changed our understanding of the ancient world. I'll show you a second one. This is, again, our big picture. So it's the kinds of things that we might expect when we're looking at the ancient world. Here's a second one. What we're looking at here is an Mesopotamian attempt to do empirical astrology, as it were. They're trying to figure out how the phases of the moon, the eclipses, the movement of the planets affect things like economy, right? And so in doing that, one of the things they did is every month, they would write down all kinds of features about the sky that they observed, and they would write down the prices of certain commodities. And they were trying to figure out how those two things interacted with each other. And of course, they never did figure that out. But what they did is they left for us, and this is in the grain market in Babylon, a list of prices that last some 400 years. It's one of the best data sets we have for ancient economy. And as economists have looked at this, one of the things that they've noticed is that the grain market or other commodity markets in Babylon were rising and falling based upon supply and demand. And so what we have then is the idea of a price fixing market. And so, for instance, date deliveries were in the fall. So as soon as the date deliveries come, you'll see the prices of dates drop. And in the back half of the year, when you're waiting for the date harvest to come in and they're slightly rarer, all of a sudden the date prices rise. But you also see sort of a randomness to the walk of the prices. We think about these random price walk. We think about the randomness to the prices that helps us to understand that this was not something that was decided by a government official. This is something that the market was deciding as it passed through time. And so not only do we have some of these pictures of long distance trade, we also have evidence that in the ancient world, they had some price fixing markets that are a lot like ours. again, what I'm trying to do here is give you just some data sets. We have very few from the ancient world that are like this, that take that first image that I showed you that was so different and soften it a little bit and tell you about some of the things that the ancients were able to do in terms of their economic activities. Let me show you a third. I told you there were four. There's going to be sort of, for this sort of big overview idea, a third idea. And it relates to this. If trade on land from something like Assyria to Kanesh was possible, trade across the Mediterranean was multiple times easier. Because of ships and because of the way in which they could carry bulk cargoes, the Mediterranean was really the first superhighway for trade. And so while we get some data from the old Assyrian caravan trade or from Babylon and Mesopotamia, we know that the heartbeat of the ancient economy, particularly during the time of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and afterwards, was the world of the Mediterranean. I'll show you a graph that I think illustrates this. This is one of my favorite graphs, and it was put together by a fellow named Parker in the early 1990s, and I'm showing you an updated version of it. What he did is he looked around the entire Mediterranean, and all he did is he located all the shipwrecks that had been found. And he tried to figure out when they were within 100 years or so, right? And based upon that, he made this graph. And the idea is that shipwrecks are going to sink over time, over a century, at a relatively steady rate, right? Storms are going to happen occasionally, and you're going to see those kinds of things. And because of that, this represents the increase in Mediterranean trade over time. And so if we look at this, we're dealing with the kingdom of Israel and Judah in this area, and we'll come back to what some of those things mean. But look at this curve as you see this vast increase in trade across the Mediterranean up until the first century. And so you see this huge increase, which is really sort of a globalizing force. It's basically this massive market that's sucking in things from all directions and moving it across the Mediterranean to places where demand is the strongest and prices are the highest, and creating this unified Mediterranean market. And it's going to be one of the features that's even true when we think about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, is we always have one eye on this major economic influence, the heartbeat of the economy of the ancient world, that is the Mediterranean. Now, some of you who are looking at this graph may wonder what happened here to cause this growth, really growth in an economic sense, to stop. Obviously, this is where we have a pandemic. And so we have here is often the Antonine plague comes up here, which in some cases killed as many as a third of the people in some regions. So really a substantive shock. And there was a number of other shocks similar to that. And the idea was the Mediterranean was such a good distributor of goods. It was such a good network that it was good for goods and it was good for pathogens as well. That openness and that integratedness sort of came back to bite it a little bit later on as people were trying to understand that world. But at its height, let me show you this one last graph before we sort of take a short stop here. One last graph, and it's this one. This, among the many, we don't have very much price data. We have very little economic data for some of these periods that's systematic. I showed you that Babylonian example. It was one of the best we have. But here we have a picture of prices across the Roman world, across the Mediterranean. And you can see some of the places that are here. You've got Madrid, so you're dealing with Spain over here, and you're also dealing with all the way down to Egypt and then the Roman province of Palestine. So you're dealing with all of these pieces as you're looking at this picture. And what one of an economist at MIT had argued, Peter Temin, is that what you see here is a relationship between price and distance from Rome. That is to say that if the prices went up in Rome, the prices were going to go up in the distant places as well, or else all the grain was going to funnel to Rome. And so prices were a combination of the price in Rome, and then you would have transportation costs to get to Rome. And so if you're in a place where you're closer to the grain fields and you didn't have the transportation costs, you would have a lower price than if you were closer to Rome. And the idea here is that the Mediterranean not only was this wonderful network, but it was a network that created a market. It created a real market in which prices were integrated across the length and breadth of this space. And so you can imagine integrated prices from Spain all the way to Judea or all the way to the land of Egypt, all sort of centered on Rome. This is kind of where we're headed. And so in the big picture, the ancients had access to a lot of concepts that we think of as modern commercial concepts. And we can see the idea of price fixing markets that were there. And then we have a big historical trajectory, and the trajectory is an ever increasing Mediterranean, integrating prices and integrating activity and building an ever stronger network that is drawing in goods from all across its hinterland. And that's our big picture view of where we are in the ancient world.
Daniel?
Yes.
Okay, so we had said at the outside, every time you come back to your village life scene, that we'll kind of ask you a framing question. And you've done a very good job outlining and painting already in 10 minutes, at least for me, a vastly different world than I would have expected, a much more globalized, integrated world. How does this image, though, that you're showing does fit with our preconceived notions of village life? Tell us a little bit about the contrasts of those two things, if you don't mind, and because we talked about that at the beginning of our course in the early days of Zionist settlement. So I think there's probably some parallels there. So
here's our proto-moshav. I'm not sure, but I'm going to punt a little bit on that question, because I've given you the big view, but we're going to need to do this. We're going to need to drill down and get closer and closer and closer, and then finally show a contrast, because you're right that what we're looking at here does not look, at least at the outset, like we see that integrated world. It looks very local. Now, there are things in this scene that would point to more integration than you might think, but still, there is something when we're talking about this that many of these villages were relatively isolated. We're not talking about a group of people who are getting all of their wine from Spain or getting all of their grain from someplace else. That's not the world that we're looking at. And so one of the questions that we're going to be asking, and one of really the critical questions, is to what extent and when and how is the Mediterranean kind of transforming society and bringing people together? And this is going to be one of our questions. So you're right, I've set up a bit of a contrast, and as we go forward, I'm going to try to fill that out a little bit more.
Great.
Then let's do that. Let's keep moving. And I want to narrow down our world, because we left with the Mediterranean in this big picture. Let's narrow it down a little bit more and say, what is it like at that part of the curve where we're dealing with ancient Israel and ancient Judah? Because at that part of the curve, if you saw the grand sort of curve I showed you before, the Mediterranean trade is not what it will be when we get to the Roman period, and its power is not what it will be. But what we find from the 10th century to the 6th century BC is that the mediating group isn't Rome. The mediating group are the coastal cities of Lebanon. These are cities that had survived the second millennium, some of the shocks of the second millennium BC. And so they were sort of oriented towards sort of merchant activity. They were right on the coast. There's some reasons why this was their focus. And so we find between the 10th and the 6th century is an ever expanding field of communication and a network that is being built by these cities. We often call them the Phoenician cities. That's one of the terms that archaeologists debate whether we should use. So I've used Tyrian and Sidonian here. Again, it's sort of the same thing. And what I've shown are two pictures. I've shown you a picture that I think I can demonstrate for something like the 10th century in terms of both a core, and we have a core over here where I would say this is an area where I think it's more likely we're dealing with a market in the sense that prices are related to each other across space. And then also we have colonies. The Phoenicians, the Tyrians and the Sidonians are setting up colonies. We have Utica over here, we have Gadir in Spain. They're taking things that are very far away, and using our latest radiocarbon dates, we can sort of picture some of their activities here already in the 10th century BC. So already in the biblical chronology, more or less the time of Solomon or a king like that of the United Monarchy, we have the Tyrians pretty far afield. And by the time we get to the 6th century, and here we might look at something like the description of Tyre by the prophet Ezekiel. And in this particular case, we have a much wider field of view where you can see these prices sort of related to each other, and then many, many more colonies in the west. They become almost their own circulation, economic circulation sphere. So this growing Mediterranean is the world that we're seeing as we're looking at the time of Israel and Judah. Now, let me show you one example of this from the 8th century BC. I was talking with Amy about this picture before, and she hadn't seen it when I showed it to her last week. And it's sort of a strange picture. People have all kinds of ideas about what they think this might be. I'm going to show you another vision of this. Some of you already have seen this many times and know what it is, but I'm going to show you a picture. This is now a 3-dimensional picture of the same thing I was just showing you. And what you can see is it's a pile, and this is a pile of wine jars. And the pile of wine jars that we have here is the cargo of an ancient Phoenician trading ship, a Tyrian ship. And so if we zoom in a little bit on this, you can see each one of these is a separate jar, and you can sort of see that they're kind of in clumps, as it were, and they were originally roped together and stacked one on top of each other. And so here we have 500, roughly, wine jars. And they're on, again, a ship that's sunk, and the hull of the ship is gone. It's been eaten away long ago. And so all that we have are the ceramics that have survived. And you get a sense for what the ship might have been like. If you look in the middle of the image, sort of in the middle of these jars, you'll see that some of them are leaning to the right and some of them are leaning to the left. And if you look at the place where they kind of meet together, join together, and you project that they would have been straight, that's where the mast would have been for this ship. And if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a stone with a hole in it. That's an anchor that would have been off the bow. And then if I turn this just a little bit and you look in the upper right-hand corner, you will see two rounder vessels. Those are cooking pots. They would have been in the galley at the stern. This is what the Phoenicians were using in order to create this network. And one of the things that we notice right away is that there are so many of these wine jars, this particular commodity. When we looked inside them, we could find specific residues that helped us to know that these were wine jars. This was an excavation that was undertaken under the directorship of Bob Ballard and Lawrence Steger in 1999. And this ship is an important one for understanding what's going on with the Phoenicians and how this economy is functioning. So here we have our wine jar. Once again, I'll show you sort of our pile of the cargo of this ship here in this photo mosaic. And we can get a sense for the way in which this ship might have been carrying these jars. But let's see what we can learn a little bit, a way we can learn more about this. Because if we look at this jar, this is I like the one I showed you that was 3D a little better. This is what we could do in 1999, and now we can do a little bit more with technology and these photographs. I want to look at these jars, because these jars, which we saw 500 of, right? As I said, they're pretty much the same. And when we looked inside of them, we found things like tartaric acid, which is sort of a residue that signals wine was in them. And so we wanted to understand what we could learn about economy from these particular jars. And by knowing that they were wine jars, one of the things that helped us understand or think about was when Ezekiel, a little later on, talks about wine trade through Tyre, he talks about the idea that the Tyrians didn't grow their own wine. They didn't make their own. They didn't grow the grapes and they didn't make the wine. Instead, other people did. In this case, they're talking about this wine of Helbon, which is near Damascus, which was famous. And they're letting those people grow the grapes and make the wine. And then those people are bringing this to Tyre. So Tyre has figured out how to be at the center of this commercial network and how to influence groups that were farther inland to make the things or to grow the things that they'd wanted to do. But then what happens is this wine arrives at Tyre. And what the Tyrians do is they rebottle it. When we looked at the inside of these jars and the clay that was used to make all these jars, this is a photomicrograph of the inside of the jar. I won't explain what we're seeing here, but I will tell you that the inclusions that are in here, the little stones that are mixed in the clay, indicate to us that this comes from clays that are on the coast near the regions of Tyre and Sidon. So what we can show is that the material is being grown elsewhere, produced elsewhere. It's then coming to Tyre where they're rebottling it in these standard containers. Okay, this is an interesting container, a standard container. We then ask the question, if it's standard, how standard is it and why? And so as we did some follow-up studies, what we realized was that these jars were very standardized, and they were standardized according to a specific logic. They were standardized according to Egyptian measurements. And so Egyptian linear measurements, both the length of the cylinder and the circumference of the cylinder, someone in Egypt, perhaps, or Tyre, knew that combining these two things in this particular way would create a specific volume. So they understood the relationship of linear and volumetric measurements, and they're building a jar that's good for sea transport, but also at the end of the day is standard, is recognizable, and will produce a quantity of wine that an Egyptian will want and will recognize. And so we have here is branding, standardization, quality control, some things that are necessary in order to make commerce easier. And so the Tyrians are working on that part of the equation. They're leaving production to people inland. They're working on some of these aspects of the transportation and the standardization and the branding of the material. And when the Egyptians get it, they refer to it as Tyrian wine. They're none the wiser, and it's in a quantity that they want. This is the kind of thing that's going on during the time when we have the kingdoms of Israel and Judah functioning in this part of the Mediterranean. So again, we're looking at a rather modern picture of some of these aspects of exchange.
Daniel, that's extremely interesting. So in the language of modern economics, going back 3,000 or maybe even more years, 4,000 years, but you're saying at least 3,000, you're describing a world where there's even container shipping in the sense that standardized containers, and there's a great deal of specialization according to comparative advantage in terms of these people that you're outlining, the Tyrians. And by the way, maybe just give us a little background, because most of us are not that familiar with all the various groups and peoples and where they lived. But these people, the Tyrians, specialized in transportation, while other groups specialized in production of the grapes themselves, et cetera, and then the wine production. And so it's a world that is similar in many ways to the world that we're living in, and very different than the Middle East of maybe even the 19th century. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have different groups of people specializing in different things. And so in that case, you can think about even groups in the Near East who were specializing in shipping as sort of thinking about some of these ideas. And so the Phoenicians had two advantages. One, they were the ones running the distribution. They understood, but the other thing is they were the only ones who knew the price differences on either side of the equation. They didn't have any competition. And so this was extremely lucrative for them. And they figured out often how to position themselves within sort of that production, distribution, consumption chain at the most lucrative part of that chain. So for instance, they might get raw ivory, and they would find that the most economic thing to do with it was to finish it, to make it beautiful in ways that their consumers were going to want. So they would do that, and then they would sell the finished ivory. They figured out that, you know, finding the ivory or anything else like that wasn't worth their time. They would always position themselves in sort of the most lucrative segment. And so again, they're an example of this sort of modern commercial mindset, I think. But again, now our question is, how are they related to this image? And how are they connecting? How are they changing things in this world?
Daniel, just real quickly, one of the listeners on the call raises a very interesting question, because you keep referencing a variety of technologies that allow you and other archaeologists to uncover some of these stories. Maybe just give us a couple minutes on how that works. And in particular, how specific can you get? Can you tell if it's red wine versus white wine, or where the grapes come from, et cetera?
No. You can find the residue that it is wine, but beyond that, in terms of something more than that, we have not been able to do that. So we could find certain tartaric acids and some other things like that that indicated us that's what we were dealing with, but beyond that, more specific, we can't. There are some people who are trying to work on extracting DNA from the pore spaces of these vessels in order to try to get more specificity in terms of what precisely it was, or trying to do those types of analyses. But these jars that we were dealing with probably are not amenable to that, because these jars were sitting underwater for 2,600 years, 500 feet down. And so you're basically dealing with high pressure and a lot of other different things like that. So it's a tricky situation. But you know, I mentioned then the ability to look inside the clay and to be able to see where something was made. We can learn a lot about the potting techniques by looking inside the clay and looking at the microscopic residues and things like that. So those are just two examples. Obviously, the Phoenician shipwrecks had to be excavated with underwater robots. And so that's its own technology. And this was an expedition that I said was led by Bob Ballard, who's the person who also rediscovered the Titanic. And so he brought a lot of that kind of experience to the work that we were doing in that particular project. But, you know, when we're working in archaeology, sort of as a summative statement, we are really trying to use all of the techniques that we possibly can to extract all the information we can from these ancient objects. They're precious, in many cases they're rare, and we're trying to study them so we can learn more about the people who made them and used them. And so really anything from chemistry or physics or of those worlds that we can use, we will. Well, let's keep going because we're going to drill down further. We're moving from the Phoenicians and now we're going to say, okay, that's one context. We talked about the networks. Now let's drill down a little bit farther and talk about a marketplace. And so here we're going to talk about a specific marketplace. We're going to talk about one that's at Ashkelon, which is near and dear to my heart. I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in the Levy expedition to Ashkelon for 25 years. It's kind of where I was raised, and my mentor, Larry Stager, sort of taught me what I know about archaeology in some amazing ways, and so I owe everything to him. And he sort of brought me along and had me sort of work with him then over the last decade or so of the project as his co-director, and now I'm working on the publication of the site. So you know where Ashkelon is here, now a city in Israel, and this is the National Park in Ashkelon, which is an ancient city surrounded by a semicircular rampart, which was built about 2,000 years BC. And approximately, just roughly speaking. And what I want to talk about is a marketplace that was found right next to the beach, right next to the coast here. And I think is the only example that we have of a marketplace in a city. It's a physical idea that we have from the ancient Near East. And so it's an important find. This is a reconstruction, one reconstruction of it. You can see there are Phoenician ships with their horse-headed prows out in the sea. And these four buildings that you see here were the four that we uncovered, and this was the marketplace that we found. So everything that you're going to see in this picture is as a result of archaeological discoveries, even though I've tried to make it more understandable by using these reconstructions that we had commissioned and work with the artists on to try to understand. So let's go down into the street and see what's going on in an ancient marketplace in this period. This is a marketplace from the 7th century BC. So after the kingdom of Israel is gone, but during the time of the kingdom of Judah. And let's zoom in and see some of the activities that are happening here. These two people that you can see in the middle of the street. You have a person checking out some wine jars, and we had wine jars in this space, and they're going to buy wine in a retail size, in a decanter or a small jug. You can see the person who's holding out a small jug to them to take. This is a wine shop, and we not only found the jars that had the wine and the decanters, which were used to give a sort of retail quantity to someone, but we also have this small little piece of pottery on which someone had almost like a Post-it note, put some things down and in ink, and they talked about selling red wine. So in this case, we can tell you whether it's red wine or white wine because they wrote it. And so we have then an activity, the artifacts that help us what's going on, but we also have the reason. We have the idea that this was a sale, that they were selling these retail quantities of wine. There's another scene just a little farther down the street. This isn't the best view, but we have to stand someplace for this picture. You can see just past the wine shop, you have cuts of meat that are hanging on the wall. When our animal bone archaeologists research the bones on the site, they don't just tell us whether this is a sheep or a goat or cow or something else like that, but they're also tracking what parts of the animal we're finding in what spaces, because they're trying to track the whole movement of the animal through its slaughter, to its selling, to its final people eating it. And so as they looked at this corner, they said, we're finding all of those bones that are the ones left over after a butcher sells all the good meat-bearing parts, right? This is what a butcher's shop residue would look like. And so we saw on the corner that what we had was a butcher shop. So you've got a wine shop, and then next to it, we had the butcher shop right in the street. And again, it's about the retail sale of some basic commodities like food and wine. This guy in the corner is carrying a sack of grain. Now he's going to a shop that you can't see that's just around the corner, so we had to have him in transit in this particular image. But the grain that he's bringing is normal grain, but within it, what you find is if you analyze all the seeds, that you not only can find out the grain, but you can find out the weeds that are mixed in with the grain. And the weeds that are mixed in with the grain sometimes are regional, right? Grain is grain, but the weeds can be specific. And so in this particular case, there was a combination of two weeds, and I've got one of them over here, the picture of that seed. Don't ask me for the Latin names for these two seeds, I'm sorry. But these two seeds, when we looked at the regions that they were from, ended up being from Judah. So what we're looking at is grain that's coming from Judah and is being carried to Ashkelon for sale in the market. And what we have then is this receipt, and this receipt is for the sale of grain from the fields of Zakar something. It could be Zakar Baal, it could be Zachariah, it could be a name. We don't know what the god was that this person worshiped, but that's the idea of this particular grain. It's coming from Judah and it's being brought into the market and then again, sold in retail quantities. I mentioned the increasing world of the Mediterranean market, and so we have people selling over here, which we found on the street, were wine jars, decorated wine jars, beautifully decorated wine jars. You can see an example of one of the ones that we found in the upper right here. This one with the warrior is a particularly beautiful one. So you can imagine a full example of that on your table, serving wine. And then what we have in the lower right is less exciting, but it's interesting to me. It's a cooking pot. And this cooking pot doesn't look great, but because of the kinds of stone that you have in Greece, and the world of the Aegean, where both of these things come from, there was a schist, a special quartz mica schist that they would put in the pottery that made it really work well under the stress of heating and cooling. And so this isn't a good looking cooking pot, but it's a better mousetrap, right? It's a better cooking pot. And so what you're finding then in this marketplace is all kinds of goods for sale from all over the Mediterranean world, from Egypt, from Greece, from Phoenicia, from Judah, all being brought together and offered for sale in this sort of retail setting. We can see how they're doing the buying and selling because we have then these balance weights. We have this sort of balances. You can see this scale pan for a balance in the upper left. This one's from the 11th century, so it's a little earlier. And they're weighing out and they're using weights to basically balance out cut silver. So in the lower left, you see fragments of a scale and balance pan and also weights that were found in this marketplace, right at the place where they were buying and selling. And here you can see an example of some silver. This is silver that's a little earlier from the 11th century, but nevertheless, this is silver in a linen bag. And then you can see once you undo the linen bag, which they did at the Israel Museum, you find out all the little cut pieces of this silver and the way in which they're weighing out silver, shekels of silver, in order to make their purchases. Now in this image, we have this fellow standing watching over everything. He's kind of got an Egyptian cast to him. That's the intent, because right next to the scales, we found all sorts of Egyptian elite objects, and it made us think that there's probably someone watching over them. In this case, Ashkelon was connected to the Egyptians at this moment, making sure it all happened right and probably taking their cut as they were overseeing the way in which such a marketplace was working. A little tax here in order to smooth things through. And so this picture then is unique. I don't know of another place in which you have all of these things together. And what we have then is a picture of what a market would have looked like and the way in which you could, in a retail setting, have purchased many of the things that you would need for daily life here in Ashkelon in the 7th century. Brian, should I continue on?
His screen is frozen, so he might be having some issues, but I don't know if you can see the question. There's a question about...
Can you hear me?
Oh, here's back.
Yes, I can, Brian.
Okay. A couple questions. Back in the centuries that you're talking about, and I believe you're saying now somewhere in the neighborhood of the Kingdom of Judah, 1600, 1700 years ago, you tell us. Take a typical individual. How much of their daily necessities would be purchased in a market versus made on their own? Is there a way to tell that? And in particular, one of the audience members asked about textiles and clothing. And fabrics. Was that all homespun and home weaving, or is there some commercial activity as well?
You saw that the old Assyrian caravan trade, one of the major things that was moving internationally was textiles. So we know that textiles were a major economic good, certainly at that time, and I think throughout this story. I'll show you in just a second some examples of the textile making process in which you have an example of imported goods and the way in which this is generating income for people on the ground in ancient Israel and ancient Judah. If you were to think, though, about a passage in the Hebrew Bible which might play a role in your understanding of this, even though it's a very difficult passage to date, it's still an important one for this question, and it is the second half of Proverbs chapter 31. If you remember in the book of Proverbs, in the end of chapter 31, there's a picture of this wise woman or this noble wife. People have different names for this person, Eshet Hayil, this person, and what you have then is this picture of a person whose income, if you read it carefully, all comes from spinning and weaving and dyeing and selling that in the marketplace. And so that picture, sort of this idealized picture of the wise woman, as it were, the wise Israelite woman, if you want to look at it even in that sense, was centered around the economic activities of weaving and the way in which it participated in the marketplace. So I do think that that's something that was part of what was going on. Having said that, I guess there was, I'm sure, there was probably a lot of homespun stuff going on as well. There was the stuff that went to the market. There was some other stuff going on that was a little less, a little lower quality, perhaps, a little easier to make. Clothing was difficult to make in any case, but in that sense, you're talking about local production.
Dana, we received another interesting question from the audience, which I think is pertinent. Was this a cash economy or was it a barter economy? And if cash, how did they obtain cash?
Right, so one of the questions is that this is requiring, particularly some of this international trade and the commerce that's proceeding through the first millennium BC is requiring ever more silver. And so this cut silver seems to be the mechanism for exchange. And as they need a larger money supply in order to facilitate a lot of these different things. How much silver was in circulation is a really difficult question for an archaeologist to answer because nobody leaves it behind unless some conqueror comes and they're not around to go pick it up again. Like it's something that you recycle quite a bit. So we don't know how much was in circulation, but something's got to be going on here. Was there also underneath this some barter economy going on? Absolutely. I think there was, and I want to look at some examples of that too.
One last question. Would the ancient temple have played a financial role in that monetary system, or was there another institution that helped facilitate?
Yeah, the ancient temple would have played a role. And again, we have a tricky question here because scholars debate the date of texts that describe the economic role of the temple. And so there's some debate as to when that would have happened and what that would have looked like. But it played several roles. But one of the core roles, it was sort of a national repository for the wealth of the nation. And so what you find out is that when kings are wealthy, they tend to put that, and often they'll style it as a religious gift. They'll put that wealth into the temple. And then you'll also find in texts when you read about it, when the kings are hard up for cash and they need to pay off someone if they're being invaded, they go back to the temple and strip all that stuff out and send it off in order to do payment. So you do get a sense for the temple as this sort of national depository.
That's great. By the way, even today, we view the Federal Reserve as a holy institution staffed by priests. We call them the Board of Governor, but that's a commentary for a different subject.
Okay.
So just to the audience out there, we have about 15 or 20 more minutes. Feel free to keep sending questions and we'll feed them into Daniel. And Daniel, I know you have your last section to start tying things together. So why don't you take it away?
Well, okay, I'm gonna sort of raise one of the questions that we had, which was how we get from that market that I just talked about in Ashkelon and get over to this particular image. And I'm gonna start with a positive case. but let's think about this image. I'm going to skip one slide, so don't worry if I just jump past one slide, and try to ask the question about markets. So let me skip one slide, and then then I'll be on this map. Great. So one of the questions we have is, to what extent does this world that we've just described for places like Tyre or places like Ashkelon apply in these inland highland regions? And we don't have a market like you have in Ashkelon, nor do we have necessarily all of the texts that talk about the commercial aspects that we see at Tyre. So to what extent have some of these things seeped into this world? And on the positive side, a number of archaeologists are arguing that the markets that we have in some place like ancient Israel or ancient Judah exist, they're just of a different type. And so what I'm showing you here are pictures of the gate at Tel Dan. Many of you have been to Tel Dan. It's wonderfully reconstructed. You can go see this Iron Age gate. And so we're looking at this plaza out front of the gate, and you can see it in the reconstruction here and over here. It's the same plaza right in here. And this is the plaza where the famous Tel Dan inscription was found. It was being used as a stone in this plaza. But the excavator of this, Avraham Baran, argued that this plaza was itself an important part of the city, because he noticed, and you can see it in some of the images down here, a couple walls of buildings that were even built outside the city walls. Why build outside the city walls? Why have this public space that's constructed outside the city walls? And he argued, and I think he's right for a number of reasons, that this was what a market looked like in ancient Israel. And that it wasn't a permanent market like you had in Ashkelon, but it was one of those occasional markets. Maybe there was a market day every month. Maybe there was a market day every week. Maybe some people came on Wednesdays and some people came on Thursdays. And the idea was that these smaller hamlets, these smaller cities, weren't big enough to maintain permanent retail spaces, but what you had then were merchants who were moving around and doing their trade here. And the reason they do their trade here was it was close to the safety of the gate, and there's a number of judicial functions that happen at the gate that could resolve disputes and that could allow the trade to take place in a way that had some backing that allowed for the transactions to be smoother and more cost efficient in terms of what was going together. And we read in the Hebrew Bible, and I'll show you one example. This is from the book of Kings. And in this particular text, we have is Elisha talking about what's going to happen. And this is at Samaria. And he talks about something normal. He says, this is in the context of siege. I know there's a big siege right now, but tomorrow it's going to be normal. What's normal? This time tomorrow, you're going to sell at the city gate. And you're going to buy then grain, you're going to buy then barley, you're going to buy these different things. You're going to pay for them with this weight of silver, right? And this is going to be the kind of thing that's going to happen regularly. And so there's a number of ways in which this seems to make sense, that at these places, certainly the larger places, you would have constructed places just outside the city gate. And maybe if you were at a tiny village that was sort of outside of Dan, you'd come in on the market days and be able to buy things, even things like your basic commodities. I show you these two pictures. They're small, and they're kind of they're small little objects, and they're not maybe I don't know how valuable they were, but what we have here on the left are the small weights that you would use in order to make thread. You put these along the end of a stick and you'd spin them, and we call them spindle whorls. And as they would spin, you'd run the thread through your hands, and the weight of this would pull it down, and then it would spin. And this is how you made thread. And one of the things, this is related to that cloth production. One of the things we notice about these, they're found in every hamlet, every tiny place in Israel and Judah, but they're made of imported, sometimes beautiful stone. Someone is bringing from a long distance these small little weights that are being purchased, that are being then brought into every household for something as basic as cloth making. So you see one side of the exchange and you know it's not local. You know it has to be long distance, right? The same thing is true on the upper right-hand side. This is a grinding stone for making bread, right? So that grinding stone for making bread is sort of a core part of what every family is doing every day. But this grinding stone for bread is made of basalt. And that is a beautiful vesicular basalt here. And we know that basalt isn't in the Negev. It's not in Jerusalem. It's not in any place. It's in Galilee, and it's in the Golan Heights and places like that. And so we have then those goods moving down, in some cases moving all the way up down from places even much farther afield that are accessible by boat, and moving down into the highlands, into every hamlet. So there's got to be a distribution system that can take care of things like this. I'll show you a biblical passage which I think highlights the extent of the way in which ancient Israel and Judah participated at this sort of lower level in a market. And this is a passage again from Kings. And again, it's a passage about Elisha, and there's a miracle involved. And we won't deal with the economic miracle that's involved here. Particularly, what I want to deal with is the stuff around it. Because in this story, if you remember this story, Elisha meets a person who is about to be have all their credit called in, and their children are going to be taken away from them. This woman, and Elisha says, I'll solve your problem with a miracle. Go get empty jars from your friends. She gets all the empty jars. The miracle is that the jars are filled with oil. Okay, that's not what I'm interested in this particular context. What I'm interested in what he tells her next, because it helps us to understand what normal is. He says at the very end, go, sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. What does this imply? It implies that she could have a large amount of oil and sell it, and the market would take it. That is to say, it was robust enough, it was big enough that it could take a surplus of oil that came on all at once, right? The second thing that we get is that she can pay her debts. She was able to have access with her sons as collateral to credit instruments here, even in ancient Israel. Right, and then if she got into trouble, obviously it would take their children. But we have then her access to that instrument is what sort of strikes me here. And then the other idea is you and your sons can live on the rest. They're obviously not living on oil for the rest of their life. They're transforming the oil into something like silver that then they can pay out for things like wine and grain and the other things that they need to live on. So you get a sense for how a person could participate in a market that did exist, and did exist not just on the coast, but even though it was to a lesser extent, and even though it wasn't quite as ubiquitous or permanent or any of those kinds of things, that there was access to that market, even to that Mediterranean market to some extent, to long distance trade for most people who were living in ancient Israel and ancient Judah.
Daniel, just to extend what you just said, we got 3 questions along the same lines regarding credit. And they all relate to, was there lending back then, which you just said there was, with rates of interest similar to how we think about it today? And how does that mesh with the story that modern banking began in Italy in the 15th century? What does modern banking look like relative to credit back during the time period you're discussing now?
There are letters of credit that we have even in the old Assyrian caravan trade where, you know, the bearer of this, you should give him a certain amount of money and I'll pay it back later. Those kinds of things that we have. There's a question of how usury was dealt with because there's a number of laws against it. And so the question is, what's good is it for the creditor? How does the creditor make money out of loaning this money out there? And so there is, as there was throughout much of the commercial world and commercial life, some question as to how legitimate it is that this creditor is getting money for what they're doing. But there are some texts that a scholar's been working on to try to understand, particularly some of the borrowing from the temple, ways in which you could pay off your debts to the temple with a gift added. And so there's some ways in which that the repayment might have a premium on it, or they might have something attached, or you might give a gift in order to be able to get into that market. So there are ways in which you might be able to style what is today thought of as interest in a way that didn't look like interest. But exactly how that worked in this situation is not entirely clear in terms of how that would have been, how the creditor would have made money in a situation in which the loan was paid back on time and in full.
If people had silver, would they store it at the temple? Would they keep it in their own homes? Where would they deposit their cash in that period of time?
When we find it, it tends to be under the floor of the house. If you remember the story in the biblical text, there's a story in the Deuteronomistic history of Achan. If you remember, he's storing silver and cloth under his tent. People wanted to keep it close at hand. And the reason I say when we find it is because when archaeologists find it, it's usually connected to an invasion that has destroyed everything so that the people who knew where the money was couldn't come back to get it. Otherwise, wherever they stored it, they went and got it. And so we think generally it was stored in the house, maybe buried under the floor or someplace hidden. And that most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people didn't forget where they put it and they didn't lose it. And so as archaeologists, we don't find it as much as we would like to if we were doing some sort of quantitative study of the amount of silver, a quantitative study even of the amount of silver changing through time. None of that can happen because it's all a question of the accident of discovery.
And the Judea was in the highlands that you just showed in that very good topographical map. How plugged in were they to the cash economy, or was that more a function of the people along the coast where the Judeans didn't typically live?
You remember some texts in the Hebrew Bible that describe things like the fish gate in Jerusalem. And what we find when we dig in Jerusalem is lots and lots of fish, some coming from as far away as Egypt. So we know, just like we saw those grinding stones or those spindle worlds, another thing that we can track that's definitely international to Jerusalem is large amounts of fish. So we know that they're plugged in at that level. We can see those things are taking place. The question that is the really hard question to answer is, what's the percentage of the economy that's characterized in this way? Is it 5% or is it 50? And because we lack quantitative information, that's where scholars disagree. To what extent is this the dominant form of exchange in ancient Israel, or to what extent is it sort of a sidelight in some special commodities or special objects that people need in order to get by?
Can you tie something together? In our first discussion, I was talking about the early days of Zionism starting in the 1880s through the 1920s. And we talked a little bit about the geography and demography of what was then Palestine and how the Arabs were living in the hills, the same hills where the Jews, the Judeans lived during the period you're talking about, is where the modern day Palestinians live. And then as you got into the lowlands, it was a largely under or unpopulated area due to the malaria, the climate, the soils. Can you tell us a little bit about what the geography and demography looked like then, and was it different than that picture today?
Yeah, I'm going to jump forward to a slide that we talked about way back when. So I'm going to, just a second, let me jump forward. Let me jump back to this slide right here. I think this is the slide we were talking about, Brian, when you and I were having that conversation. Because one of the things we were looking at was the question of highland versus lowland. And there's no question that the highlands were more isolated and in many cases less connected to some of those market ideas than the lowlands were. And your sort of proximity to a major trade route made a difference in terms of your access to materials. So all of those things are the case. Eventually, you were part of this big system. Like eventually you were connected somehow. And even grain and olive oil and things like that are coming from Israel down to places like Tyre. And so the market's there. It's constantly there. But your sort of the difficulty of getting to you does make a difference in terms of how these things are put together. Now, we were talking then also about sort of where people lived, generally speaking. And you're right that in pre-modern times, people did not live in some of these valleys in quite the same way they do today. So for instance, the Jezreel Valley in the middle of this image, the middle of the Jezreel Valley was swamps. It was swamps up until the 20th century, really, as so was the area in the upper part of this image of where Hatzor is. This area here was also malarial swamps. And finally, this area here of the Shimron Plain. The drainage wasn't good enough. The technology wasn't good enough. And so while people were on the fringes of this area and the better drained parts were actually quite productive, that the valleys weren't as extensively inhabited as they were once technology existed to be able to drain them. And so when we think about agriculturally productive lands today, we would look at something like a Google Earth view of the Jezreel Valley, and we would say that's the area that you want to be in. But of course, in antiquity, you would look at the small terraced farms that would be on the hillsides and at the fringes of the valleys, and that's where you'd find most people living. You'd find that would be true in the time of ancient Israel. You'd find that would be true in many times since then.
Daniel, we're now at noon. We promised everybody an hour. If you don't mind, let me just sneak in the last two questions. Those people who need to sign off, we're very pleased that you were able to join us for this series, and we will make it available in a recording that we'll send out to all of you. We got two questions, and I'll just pose both these questions, and you can take them in whatever order you'd like. How did the forgiveness of all debt every 7 years affect the ancient economy? First one. Second one, we read that for centuries before Zionist settlement, the land we know as Palestinian was very impoverished. Do we have evidence of that, and how does that relate to the time periods that you're talking about?
Right, so let's see. I'll talk about the impoverishment of the land first and say that there were good times and there were bad times. When you're talking about thousands of years, you're talking about sometimes when the land was flourishing in its entirety and sometimes when the land was rather poor. And it depended in many cases on the circumstances in the Mediterranean. So if you had no Eastern Mediterranean trade, that made this area very difficult to sort of to have a flourishing area. It became very isolated and very sparsely inhabited. Or if you had international connections and international trade like you do today, where Israel is incredibly connected to the rest of the world in a whole host of ways, it's kind of it's a draw, it's a magnet for people who are at its fringes in terms of its economy. And so the same thing was true in the ancient world as well, in terms of having times of plenty and times of weakness. And that's one of the things we like to study. I've studied at Ashkelon. I continue to study in my new excavations at Tel Shimron. And Brian, can you repeat the first question again?
Sure. By the way, one quick commentary. As you get into more modern times, the discovery of America dealt a tremendous economic blow to the Middle East because they had a monopoly of trade to Asia until that period of time. So that's for a whole other webinar. The debt forgiveness every 7 years.
Yeah.
How was that implemented and how did that affect the economy?
It wasn't implemented as far as we can see. That is to say, it was an ideal. It's not clear that either the sabbatic year, this idea of every 7 years, or the year of Jubilee, we don't have examples of it actually being done. Indeed, the only time that you have a reference to the 7-year discussion is in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is asking people to free their slaves after 7 years, which is something that's discussed in the book of Exodus, among other places. And it turns out that people free their slaves, but do so in a way that causes them to be enslaved right away, and they sort of bring them all back. And so there are ways people are, even that narrow idea, people are trying to work around. So while it is true that we have this picture of this year of Jubilee and some of those different things mentioned in laws, it's not clear that these laws were followed in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah to the degree that the writers of those laws would have liked.
Well, on that note, it's good to know that looking for the loophole is one of the most ancient customs that you've discussed. So we want to thank you, Daniel. This has been fascinating. And from my own perspective, I would love to do this more with you and with the Friends of the Israel Antiquities Authority. The world of archaeology is fascinating, and you've given us a very nice introductory window to what you do in that world. And we want to thank you very, very much for this hour.
Thank you, Brian.
And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great day.